The next major prosecution witness was a former fellow traveler, a refugee from the Popular Front of the 1930s. His name was Henry Julian Wadleigh. One very perceptive writer on this case, the liberal intellectual Leslie Fiedler, described him as the cartoonist's pink tea radical, with thick glasses, disordered hair, and acquired Oxford accent. Wadleigh's story, in substance, was as follows. I'm the son of an Episcopalian minister. I was born in Massachusetts, but spent most of my youth in Europe. I have degrees in economics from Oxford and the London University School of Economics. I did some more study at Kiel in Germany and the University of Chicago, but received no degree from either. I came to believe long ago in Fabian socialism. That's a gradual evolution towards socialism, and I joined the Socialist Party. However, I never believed in communism, and it would have been a violation of my principles to join the Communist Party. Wadleigh's one of these people to whom all these isms are very, very important. I went to work for the U.S. government in 1930 at the Federal Farm Board, and in 1932 in the Department of Agriculture. A few years later, I learned that one of my fellow socialists, Eleanor Nelson, had joined the Communist Party. In 1935, I told Ms. Nelson that because of the rise of fascism in Europe and the Soviet Union's stance against fascism, I would like to collaborate with the Communist Party. It seemed to me at the time that the Soviet Union was offering the only effective opposition to the fascists in Italy, Germany, and Japan, and I asked Ms. Nelson if there was anything I could do. In March 1936, I joined the State Department, working in the Trade Agreements Division, same place as Alger, and specializing in money and trade controls and studying how foreign countries manage their currencies and their trade with the United States. I was far below Alger Hiss's level. He was a couple of steps in the pyramid above me. Although each of us knew who the other was, we very seldom met. Maybe once or twice a year, I and a bunch of other people went to a meeting in his office. Well, Ms. Nelson got back to me very soon after I joined the State Department in 1936. She said that it would be very useful if I could supply her with any information that I came into possession of as part of my job in the State Department about economic conditions in Germany and Japan. I agreed to do this, and I began passing her documents to, as we used to put it, the other side, which I understood to mean the Soviet Union. I passed only documents that crossed my desk in the normal course of business. These mostly concerned economic conditions in foreign countries, especially Germany and Japan. I knew Colonel Buykov. I met him in connection with my passing documents. He was especially interested in knowing details about any preparations that the fascist powers were making for war against the Soviet Union. I continued passing State Department documents to the Soviet Union in this manner without authorization about once a week until there was a distinct lull in this activity. I didn't get many calls anymore in early 1938. And then in mid-February 1938, my contact, the man to whom I was passing the documents, told me to stop. On March 9th, 1938, I left Washington on a 9-month trip to Turkey. And I left Washington on March 9th, didn't come back until December 31st. Now, most weeks, the person to whom I gave State Department documents, and we would meet during the workday at a street corner in Washington, and I would pass him a briefcase, and he would bring them back to me the next morning. Most weeks, the person to whom I gave the documents was a man who called himself Harold Wilson, but whom I now know is actually named David Carpenter. But on several other occasions in this period, and I don't remember how many, I gave my State Department documents to another person. And this man was introduced to me as Carl Carlson, but I now recognize him as Whittaker Chambers. I remember his remarkably bad teeth. One of his front teeth was chipped diagonally, and he spoke in a puzzling accent, which I took to be foreign. I thought that he might be Russian. Well, I came back from Turkey in December 31, 1938, and shortly thereafter, Mr. Chambers summoned me to another meeting out of the office, and we met at a corner, and he said to me, "I just deserted, that's all. I'm going to become a bourgeois now." And then he patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's what you will have to do, too." He said that he had been summoned to Moscow and feared for his life, and that's what made him break with the Russians. Now, a few weeks later, he called me again at the State Department, and he sounded desperate. And when I said, "Who is it?" he said, "Carl, Carl, Carl." And he said he had to meet me again in Jackson Place right now. And I thought, right across the street from the State Department and the White House, and it's terribly dangerous. And he said, "Do you want me to starve?" And I didn't want to make a scene in the, God forbid he comes into the State Department building, so I said, "Okay, I'll meet you." And I went to this dangerous place and half expecting to find him flanked by FBI agents. But when we met, he said that he was absolutely destitute and needed money, $10. And in order to avoid a scene, I looked in my wallet and I had a 1 and a 20, and I gave him the 20. And that was the last I saw him until very recently, and he never paid me back. Wadleigh said, "I did not deliver any documents to any unauthorized person after mid-February 1938. Now, after the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was made public in the fall of '39, I realized I'd been naive in thinking that helping the Soviet Union was a good way to fight Hitler. There had always been something quite distasteful to me in this work, and since World War II, I've worked for the UN and for the government of Italy. Now, I assumed all along that what I was doing was breaking the law, but I thought of myself as a fighter against fascism before it was fashionable. I didn't think I was doing anything morally wrong or unpatriotic, and God help me, I feel the same way today. I cannot imagine that the documents I passed, which are about trade with foreign countries, nothing military, had any damaging effect on the security of the United States, would be used to injure the U.S. I just wanted to help the Russians get ready to fight Germany and Japan. And everybody likes to forget it today in 1949, but a couple of years after I did what I did, we in the Soviet Union were on the same side fighting Germany. And frankly, if what I did brought forward the defeat of fascism by 1 hour, I think I did nothing wrong and my conscience is clear. And that's Julian Wadleigh's testimony. Now, who does it help? If he's believed, and I can't think of anyone who's ever denied that what he said was true. Maybe I forgot something, but I think most everybody thinks he was telling the truth. If he's telling the truth, he shows that Chambers isn't making it all up. There really was a spy ring in the State Department. Chambers was one of the hubs, and the way Wadleigh said he functioned in the spy ring is very consistent with how Chambers talked about it. And also, I think Wadleigh undercuts Hiss's defense of reputation, or that people have gone to Harvard and the State Department, they just don't spy for the Soviet Union. Here's a guy who's that kind of person, walks, talks, quacks a lot like Alger Hiss, and he says that he did all those things. But Wadleigh may also present an opportunity for the defense, because the defense has been saying all along, yeah, Chambers was a spy, he was a commie, he was a traitor, all that stuff. And there was a spy ring in the State Department that Chambers ran, but Hiss wasn't part of it. And that requires the Hiss defense, if they're going to put forward a story, to say that Chambers got the documents from somebody else. Someone who had access to Hiss's office and all the papers that crossed Hiss's office in the normal course of business. And they'd always been saying it was Mr. X. Well, Julian Wadleigh is Mr. X. The Hiss defense would like to be saying. A flesh and blood human being who confesses and not some shadowy letter from the alphabet. And at both trials, and I'm going to combine them here for simplicity, Hiss's counsel labored mightily to convince the jury that Wadleigh was the source of the documents that Chambers gave him. When Lloyd Paul Stryker cross-examined Wadleigh, Wadleigh started out with what Alistair Cook said was a tense and confident jauntiness. And Lloyd Paul Stryker decided to make him look like a complete overeducated snob and a dreamer, just like Chambers. All communists are like that, compared to the solid 2 feet on the ground, respectable, innocent Alger Hiss. And Wadleigh was enough of an oddball to give Stryker a good chance at it. Stryker asked Wadleigh, "Isn't it possible, might you not, in service of communism and the Soviet Union, have snuck into someone else's office in the State Department and filched documents from their scrap basket or their outbox?" And Wadleigh said no. He said, "Even if I had seen a sufficiently rich find in someone else's desk," he said, "I never did anything so foolish as to steal from someone else's office, and certainly not from a wastebasket, as if there are some things that a gentleman just doesn't do. And Stryker looked at him as, okay, so it's fine to spy for the Soviet Union and betray your country and violate your oath of office, but look in a scrap basket. Oh, that would be naughty. Well, Stryker said, how do we know you're telling the truth? Weren't you sympathetic to the communists? And isn't one of their tenets lying? And Wadleigh said, I would hardly call that a tenet. I would call it a procedure. And Stryker said, I'm not going into semantics. I didn't go to Oxford. Did you ever eavesdrop on someone else's office? Your conscience would have kept you from doing that? And Wadleigh said, I just did not do that kind of thing. And Stryker's eyebrows shot up and he said, but as a matter of conscience, you wouldn't have had the slightest conscientious scruple in pilfering from other desks, would you? And Wadleigh said, well, I never did so, and so the question of conscience never arose in my mind. One gets conscientious scruples when one contemplates doing something, when the question arises. But the question never arose in my mind, and therefore I have no recollection of having had any conscientious scruples against doing it. In other words, your question is a hypothetical one. And during this long answer, Stryker had gone from the to limp and his eyes rolling around the courtroom, and he said, when Wadleigh said, your question is a hypothetical one, he said, oh, I dare say, my question is very faulty, but you will have to bear with me. I do the best I can. I realize that you have the benefit of London University and Oxford. And Wadleigh, not realizing he's being made a fool of, says, that is right. And Stryker says, by the way, you still seem to have some of that Oxford accent, don't you? And Prosecutor Murphy sees his witness going down in flames, so he jumped up and just said, Your Honor, I object. And Judge Kaufman was unable to rule on the objection for a while because he was laughing so hard that he had to hide his face in his papers. Now, note that Stryker's aiming very high here. He does not ask Wadleigh, isn't it true that you're the one who gave all these papers to Chambers? Wadleigh would have said no. He doesn't want the jury to hear that. He just asks a bunch of sort of hypothetical questions about state of mind that plant in the jury's mind the possibility that Wadleigh's the guy who gave Chambers all the documents. It's as if Stryker's walking down the boulevard of the Hiss defense and comes to a side street that says maybe Wadleigh gave Chambers the documents, and he just sort of shines his flashlight on the street sign and walks on. Stryker told the newsman afterwards that he had gone light on Wadleigh because he was just a poor thing laying there bleeding. Well, Hiss's lawyer at the second trial decided on the opposite approach and went down the Wadleigh gave the papers to Chambers alley, bathed every corner in light and left no stone unturned. And he took Wadleigh through every one of the more than 100 documents that Chambers had produced that he said he got from Hiss and said, Mr. Wadleigh, did you give this document to Whittaker Chambers? And Wadleigh answered no, 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 no as to each one. He said, I gave Chambers or Carpenter only documents that crossed my desk in the normal course of my job. And those were documents about foreign trade that a mid-level staff specialist would see. Chambers' documents about high-level military matters or whether Hitler's going to invade Austria or high-level diplomacy never crossed my desk. Some of that stuff is so far above my pay grade I get a nosebleed thinking about it. That would never have crossed my desk, and Chambers obviously got them from someone else. Wadleigh was adamant that none of the 4 notes in Hiss's handwriting came from Chambers. He said, I do not go into other people's office and filch from their scrap baskets. How about the typewritten documents? Most of them, but not all, were dated after March 9th. And after that, anything after March 9th, Wadleigh can't have given Chambers because Wadleigh was in Turkey then, on the other side of the world. Now, Wadleigh did say about the typed papers typed before late February that a few of them concerned foreign trade and so might conceivably have crossed my desk, and I might conceivably have given them to Chambers. But at the end of an incredibly detailed cross-examination and then redirect and recross and back and forth, he was adamant that there was no way that he gave most of the typed documents to Chambers, and it was only conceivable that he gave a few of them to Chambers, and he very much doubted that he gave Chambers a single one. About all the typed documents, too, you might ask the question, if Chambers got typed documents from Wadleigh, there'd be no reason to have Mrs. Hiss type up copies of them, or anybody type up copies of them. If Chambers got a document from Wadleigh, he'd just have it photographed. And that leaves, for the stuff you can pin on Wadleigh, the pumpkin papers, the 2 rolls of film that contained the pictures of 7 State Department documents totaling 58 pages. They all date from when Wadleigh was still in Washington, not gone to Turkey. And maybe Hiss's lawyer at the second trial thought, maybe I can at least pin the pumpkin papers on Wadleigh. Wadleigh said, He said, the pumpkin papers, they're 5 of the 7, concerned a pending U.S.-German trade agreement. I worked on U.S.-German trade. It's conceivable, remotely possible that I gave those to Chambers, but I think it most improbable and extremely improbable, because I remember these documents concern a current negotiations about a new U.S.-German trade agreement, and Wadleigh says, I don't think I even worked on that. So those would not have, I was in that general area, but I didn't work on that particular issue. I think it's highly unlikely they ever crossed my desk. There's another problem with Wadleigh being the source of any of the pumpkin papers. The 2 rolls of pictures, you remember, were all taken on one night. That meant that Chambers got all the photographed documents from one guy in the State Department. The other pumpkin papers, the other 2 of the 7 documents in the pumpkin papers, concerned the Chinese Civil War and Japanese machinations in China and the possibility of the Soviet Union going to war with Japan. And that, he said, would never have crossed my desk. And because those documents would never have crossed my desk, the other pumpkin papers would never have crossed my desk. So there's no way I can even be the source of the pumpkin papers. Now, if you think about it, this means that Chambers got the pumpkin papers from somebody other. He got all the photographs, State Department documents, from somebody in state who had access to Wadleigh's documents and other documents too, meaning someone higher than Wadleigh. And gee, I wonder who that could be. The 2 pumpkin papers that never went to Wadleigh's office did go to the office where Hiss worked, and they bore the initials AH in pencil, which is how you noted that you had read the document. And perhaps this is why Lloyd Paul Stryker in the first trial didn't go down that alley and go into the documents in great detail. Now, also at the second trial, the judge allowed much more cross-examination about Wadleigh's motives and mores, and I think this may have had an impact on the jury. Hiss's lawyer really was sort of condemning Wadleigh, still trying to prove, sort of the way Stryker had done, but without Stryker's wit, what a weird, sick, morally weird guy Wadleigh was. And he said, you were a thief of documents from the State Department. And Wadleigh said, I wasn't a thief. I did not, these documents came to me. People sent them to me. I didn't steal them from my office. And yes, I took them out of the building, but I always bought them back. And if you're going to be a thief, you have to have an intent to permanently deprive the rightful owner of the thing stolen. And I had no such intention. And Wadleigh was asked, you knew you were a traitor to the United States? And he said, no. Well, you knew these papers were being turned over to the Communist Party, didn't you? Yes or no? And Wadleigh said, I did not consider myself a traitor, and I still don't. I felt I was doing the right thing. I was acting in accordance with my convictions at that time. Well, those convictions were the convictions of a communist, weren't they? And Wadleigh said, my views were pretty close to communist views, but I was not a member of the Communist Party. And Hiss's lawyer said, well, let us see how much you did subscribe to communistic theory or tenets. Did you believe in the forceful overthrow of the government of the United States by any means whatsoever at the proper time? And Wadleigh said, I don't think I did, no. Did you believe in the church? And Wadleigh said, no. And then Hiss's lawyer asked him, did you believe in the American way of life? And Alistair Cook said, Wadleigh put his index finger on his cheekbone and thought deeply for a moment and said, substantially as I conceived it at that time, yes. So I think what Wadleigh's answers did, and provoked by Hiss's lawyer, was to take the jurors by the hand and lead them down the intellectual path by which a man who came from the same kind of world as Hiss could come to spy for the Soviet Union and not feel the slightest twinge of conscience about it. In fact, could feel that he was serving the long-run interests of his country, feel superior. Now, the liberal Leslie Fiedler I mentioned earlier found Wadleigh equally laughable and reprehensible. Wadleigh, Fiedler later wrote, attempted to declare his innocence and guilt at the same time. With no sign of contrition, he admitted passing secret documents to Chambers, but he insisted that his course had been justified by history. The clowning of Wadleigh reveals what is not so easily read in Hiss, a moral obtuseness which underlies the whole case. The true protagonist of tragedy suffers and learns. Wadleigh has learned nothing. He cannot conceive of having done anything really wrong. He finds in his own earlier activities only a certain excessive zeal overbalanced by goodwill. That the irony of events made him, just insofar as he was more idealistic and committed, more helplessly the tool of evil, he cannot conceive. In the end, his confession is almost as crass a lie as the denial of Hiss, a disguise for self-congratulation, a device for clinging to the dream of innocence. He cannot believe that a man of liberal persuasion is capable of wrong. I think that when all was said and done, Wadleigh did damage to the Hiss defense. He corroborated Chambers' testimony about the spy ring, and the defense's attempt to make him into the real thief of the documents failed. And he explained to the jury how men like Alger Hiss came to spy for the Soviet Union.